The Strange New World of the Bible, an introduction. The first thing that I would like to introduce to you is the text of the Old Testament. When we say the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, what kind of text do we have in mind? So we talked about the different translations, the NIV, the King James Version, the NRSV, and so on. But there are other earlier texts that we need to know about. So the text of the Hebrew Bible, for the most part, when we will be talking about the Hebrew Bible, we will be referring to something called the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the standard Hebrew text of the Old Testament. The Masoretic text was called the Masoretic text because the scholars who inserted the vowels on the Hebrew text were called the Masoretes. So imagine that. The Hebrew Bible, when it was written only in consonants, only the Hebrew alphabet. It had no vowels on it. Then this group of scholars, in the medieval period, actually, it's not very old. In the medieval period, they started inserting the vowels on the Hebrew text, on the consonants. And they were called Masoretes. Therefore, the standard Hebrew text of the Old Testament is called the Masoretic text, and usually abbreviated into MT. The complete manuscript of the MT or the Masoretic text dates to the year 1009 CE. CE is the Common Era, which is in other contexts, people would say AD. We try to use BCE and CE because they are more open to interreligious contexts, especially with people who do not accept Jesus as Lord. Right? So think about this. The complete manuscript of the Old Testament that we have that has the vowels on it goes back to the 11th century CE. That's the Masoretic text that any kind of translation that you have likely used it as its primary source when they were translating the Bible or the Old Testament specifically into your own language. Does this mean that we don't have anything prior to that? That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that the complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament goes back to the 11th century CE. Prior to that, we have another textual evidence or witness, which called the Septuagint or the LXX. These are Roman numerals for the number 70. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. There is a legend or a story that scholars doubt that it really happened in this way, that Ptolemy II, in around the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era, asked 72 elders of the Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and they translated it in 72 days. That's pretty fast to do that. And it's problematic because even the Greek translations of the Bible are multiple. It's not just one Greek translation of the Bible. There are multiple Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. It's likely that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, but not necessarily in 72 days by 72 people. So the Jewish community in Egypt in the 3rd century needed the Bible not to be read in Hebrew, but in Greek. The challenge there is that the Greek translation, the Septuagint, has many books that we do not have in the Protestant canon of the Hebrew Bible. And the order of the books in the Septuagint is quite different than the order of the books in the Hebrew text itself. We're going to talk about this when we come to the canon, the different canons. That's the Greek translation. Then we have another textual witness, which is the Vulgate. It's the translation of the Bible into Latin by Saint Jerome. Was commissioned by Pope Damascus in 382 CE. One of the significant things about the Vulgate that is different than the old Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible is that Jerome likely to have relied on the Hebrew text to translate it into Latin and not on the Greek. Like the Greek Bible, the Septuagint was the Bible used, but Jerome actually decided to go back to the Hebrew, not the Greek translation. Are you all following this? Okay. But there is another important and significant source for the Hebrew Bible, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. This picture right there is from the Great Isaiah Scroll in the Israel Museum in Israel. In 1947, a shepherd by accident discovered jars that had manuscripts in it. And these manuscripts, some of them were written in Hebrew and some of them were written in Aramaic, and they were in caves close to the Dead Sea in Israel. The date of these texts likely to go back to the period between 250 BCE to 70 CE. That there was a community living in these caves and copied, preserved, wrote texts in Hebrew and Aramaic. And some of these texts are also biblical texts. But the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which sometimes abbreviated as DSS, has more than Bible manuscripts or Bible scrolls. It has writings particular and peculiar to the Qumran community. Things that arrange their own community and their life together. Their views, their theological views about the world and about God and about Jerusalem and the relationship to the temple and the like. But it also have fragments from almost all of the Hebrew Bible except for the book of Esther. They don't have any fragments, at least so far, from the book of Esther. And the most common books that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the books Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and Psalms, which means that these books will likely held in some sort of an important place for them. Now, when you imagine how biblical scholars translate the Bible that you have in your hand, they likely start with the Masoretic text, right? They start with the Masoretic text, but then as they translate, some things are hard to understand about the Masoretic text. So they check out the Greek translation. They check out the Qumran texts. They check out the Vulgate and even the Peshitta, which is the Syriac translation of the Bible. Sometimes when they are also translating, they find some differences between the Hebrew text and the Septuagint, the Greek text. So they ask, why? Why do we have differences here? Does the difference come from the fact that the translator of the Septuagint was using a different Hebrew text that is different than the Masoretic text? That is, if you think about it as a tree, the Hebrew text in the Masoretic text is coming from a branch, but the Septuagint of that book, the Greek translation of that book, was actually reading a different Hebrew text of that book, and therefore they reached that different translation. And that discipline is called textual criticism. Textual criticism is the kind of criticism or engagement with the textual witnesses, including the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, the Vulgate, the Qumran manuscript, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, in order to find the most plausible reading. Not the original, because that's disputed, but the most plausible reading. That's why sometimes we have differences in translations. Some translations chose to stick to the Masoretic text, even if it doesn't make sense, and other ones said, no, the Greek text here makes more sense, and so on. So that's the kind of like discipline of textual criticism that tries to understand the nature of the text themselves and also to offer the most plausible reading of the text. So for you now, as someone who is taking your first class in the Bible, or if you have done classes in the Bible before, one of the things you need to be asking yourself when you read different translations is, why did the translator make that decision? Is it different because the translator has a particular theological conception and therefore they chose to put these verses in that way? Or did they make a decision about what might be more plausible as an original text? More plausible reading, be it from the Masoretic text or the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls. This does not mean that the Bible translations are not reliable. They are reliable, but I want you to remember that any translation is an interpretation. Any translation is an interpretation. And any translation and any translator had to make critical decisions when they were reading the text on which version to follow. Should they follow the Masoretic text here? Or should they follow the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls? Sometimes the Dead Sea Scrolls agree with the Masoretic texts. Sometimes it agrees with the Septuagint, and sometimes it disagrees with both. Which, if you want to push that conclusion even further, we could say that the way sometimes we envision the text as a closed kind of process, that was not happening at that time, at least of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were, in some ways, it's a more dynamic process rather than a static process as sometimes we assume. And that's sometimes unsettling for people who approach the Bible as this kind of like closed, done deal kind of text. It is, in the sense that nobody among us here is adding to the Bible. We're working with the earlier versions and the earlier traditions, textual traditions. And before 1947, we did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this whole thing is also dependent on the work of scholars and the work also, or the discoveries of archaeologists. Even the discovery of other languages sometimes help us and help translators to understand the grammar of the Hebrew text even better. So it's not just about, the manuscripts of the Bible. Sometimes it's even about understanding a grammatical concept. because scholars or archaeologists discovered another Semitic language that has this cognate or this grammatical form that was disputed, and now scholars can actually say, no, but the Hebrew here, because of this discovery now, could mean that. So what I hope you take out of this is that the Bible that you have in your hands is reliable, but it's not a static and a dead thing. It's reliable as a witness to God's revelation and God's self-disclosure to the people of Israel. But at the same time, it was more dynamic than static thing. It was a messy process rather than a clear-cut process. And that sometimes is unsettling for us as contemporary readers, where we just treat the Bible as this closed, bounded book. But as we read more and discover more and learn more about the Bible, I want you to hold these things in tension. It's a reliable witness. We're not questioning the authority or the authenticity of the Bible, but we're questioning what we have assumed about the Bible as contemporary readers. And we need to learn how to distinguish these two, between what the Bible is as we get closer to its historical context and what we have assumed the Bible to be because of our own impositions and dogmatic or contemporary ideas that we have forced on the Bible. Any questions on this so far? Yes.
I see that language is evolving, right? It's changing from time to time.
Yes.
Even the same language.
Yes.
So now the majority text is in the 11th century, and we try to put vowels in there. And how do people compensate for graphic language? How do scholars compensate just to have the same meaning?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
how do they understand? Just because the language maybe that they are really totally different.
Yes.
The English my kids are talking is like weird for me now. So I don't understand some of the words, even just like in the same generation gap.
Yes. So the question here is about the change in language itself and the gap between the consonantal text and the vowels.
Yeah.
Very good. So on one level, even just a general reading of the Hebrew Bible, you could tell that Hebrew in the Hebrew text in Exodus 15 is different than the Hebrew text in the Joseph narrative. The words they use, like some changes in the language itself. So that's like even within the Hebrew Bible itself, you could tell that it has stages, either from early Hebrew, classical Hebrew, or late Hebrew. Okay, that's even within the text itself. But then your other point is about the continuity and the discontinuity in the language, and I think we could rely on because the text by then was already like standardizing in codices or in manuscripts, and there were communities that are reading it and using it in worship in synagogues and churches and the like, especially in synagogues in Hebrew. So there was some sort of like the way it was preserved in some ways. It might be disputed because the pointing here might differ from here, and there are like some even questions about, is this word here a noun or is it a verb? And which reading would be more like suitable for this context? Is it passive or is it active? And sometimes the Masoretes inserted these vowels, but scholars need to sometimes even disagree with the Masoretes and say the voweling here might not be the most accurate one. But the consonantal text, the Masoretes did not mess with. They didn't say, oh, you know what? They used to say it this way a few centuries ago, but so let's mess with it now to make it appropriate for the 11th century. They preserved the consonantal text. It was only the vowels so that people would be actually able to read it. And it would not just be, depending on what your preference is or your grammatical skills. One other question?
So I'm thinking about like adding to the scripture. as a student of the Bible, if it's natural for me to approach any text with my context or historical background,
Mhm.
and then also look at it from like the context of like the old, if I can put it that way, like original context.
Yes.
And then my background. How do I interpret the word without adding? And what would you say is adding to the scripture?
Yeah, so I think what I meant by adding is that when I'm trying to problematize our view of the text as a kind of like a static process, the Bible just came from God to the scribe, and the scribe wrote it, and it was sealed, and that was it, is that it was way more messy than that, even in the ancient context. They would speak orally, and then it would later be written, and then a community would take that text on, and then they make additions to it, and so on. And we have actually, like, we could tell within the biblical texts themselves that it was way complex than just God speaking to one person, and that person just wrote it down. So what I'm saying about adding is, like, we as contemporary readers, we don't add to the Bible. Right, so it's not that we are. When I'm saying it's not static, that means the canon is open now. You could add any book you want. No, that's not what I'm saying. I was referring more to the time. So let's differentiate between the formation of the text itself, how the text came to be the text, and then the process of canonization, which is also, as you can see from like in a little bit when I show the table. And even the Masoretic text or the Septuagint was also fluid. In Alexandria, they added books on the Bible than the ones that were preserved in the Hebrew canon. That's why the Catholic canon is different than the Protestant canon. And the Protestant canon and the Catholic canon are different from the Orthodox canon. And all of these are different in their arrangement of the books from the Jewish canon. So I was referring to the period of the formation of the texts themselves. It was more fluid. The canonization also has different traditions in it. But for us now as contemporary readers, our place where we are engaging with the text from our context is that we understand it differently because of who we are. So we're not adding to the text, we're adding to what it means. We're not adding to the text, but we're adding to what it means to us as a community that live in a different context. And I will say in a bit that what's new and strange might actually have been there all along, and we just couldn't see it because of other cultural barriers. And now, because someone is reading from a particular context, they are able actually to point something that was all along in the text. And for some particular reasons, we just stopped seeing it. So the strange and the new might have been old all along, but we don't see it as well as they have seen it in the past. So this is the text. Now the canons, I will send your way, and it is also posted on Moodle, a table. Andrew, would you pass it, please? Thank you. A table of the different canons of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. On the left, you have the Jewish canon. Next to it is the Protestant canon, and then the Catholic canon, and then the Orthodox canon. I want to highlight a few things about these different canons. I can't get into like all of the history of the canonization and the content of these books. I just want you to realize that when you are referring to the Bible, even within the Christian traditions, we're not always referring to the same Bible. Even if within the Orthodox tradition and the Catholic tradition, they treat these other books as what we might call the Apocrypha, as deuterocanonical, like they are not of the same level of canonicity as the other books. They're still part of the Bible for them. They are read, and sometimes they shape the theologies as well of these different traditions. And in an ecumenical setting, we need to understand that when we use the word Bible, we need to be conscious of that. Even in an interreligious setting, the way your Bible is arranged is different from the rabbi in the synagogue or your Jewish neighbor. So I want you, when you have some time at home, work through this table, familiarize yourself with these different canons, but I want to highlight a few things. And we'll be mostly focused on the left column, the Jewish canon, because that's in some ways new to us and to some of us. The Jewish canon is divided into 3 parts. The Torah, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then the prophets. And in Hebrew, prophets is Nevi'im. Nevi'im. Here, that's your Torah is your first Hebrew word now. Nevi'im, which means prophets, is your second Hebrew word. It's plural from Nabi, Navi. And it's divided into 2 parts. The former prophets and the latter prophets. The latter prophets have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 prophets, which is in the Hebrew canon is treated only as one book. Surprisingly, and that's a surprise for most Protestants and people who grow up with a Protestant canon or Catholic canon or Orthodox canon, is that in the Jewish tradition, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are among the prophets. What does that say about the meaning of prophecy then? Is it about telling the future? We'll come to that, but think about this, the way in the Jewish canon, these books are actually among the prophets. Is it because they have Elijah and Elisha and Samuel and therefore they are part of the prophets? A possibility. But what would they add then about the genre of prophecy? If you notice there, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, in your Bible, or if you look to the right, in the Protestant canon, in the prophets, right after Ezekiel, you have Daniel. In the Jewish canon, Daniel is not among the prophets. Daniel is part of the Ketuvim, the writings, the 3rd part of the canon. What does that say about the genre, the type of literature that is the book of Daniel? Why is Daniel not among the prophets in the Jewish canon? If you also look there in the Jewish canon, you notice that the book of Ruth is not right after the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is all the way down, mentioned among the 5 scrolls that are read in 5 different Jewish festivals. In the Protestant canon and the Catholic canon, it is right after Judges because the book of Ruth happens in the days of Judges. So the Septuagint, which is the order of the books that the Protestant canon follows and the Catholic canon follows, decided to put the book of Ruth right after the book of Judges because historically it connects with the book of Judges. The first verse in the book of Ruth, it says, in the days of Judges. Well, then where would you put it? Right after the book of Judges. In the Hebrew text itself, not in the way the Ketuvim or the writing is arranged here, the book of Ruth comes right before the book of Proverbs. Sorry, right after the book of Proverbs. Not in the order here, because this order I changed a little bit because I wanted to combine the 5 scrolls. How does the book of Proverbs end? The woman of valor, the mighty woman, the strong woman. Ishet Chayil in Hebrew. And Ruth is described in the book of Ruth as Ishet Chayil, a woman of valor. So in the Hebrew canon, the book of Ruth comes after Proverbs. If you are looking for an example of a strong woman, here is Ruth as an example.
Where is that happening? You said in the Hebrew canon, Ruth is coming after Proverbs.
So Ruth would come right after Proverbs, but this listing here of the Ketuvim is not following the order as much as it's trying to separate the 5 scrolls out of what we have here. So I will print to you that order of the Ketuvim in a way that would help you see that. Yeah. Another interesting difference between the Protestant canon or the Catholic canon, the Orthodox canon, if you exclude Maccabees, follows that in some ways, 4th Maccabees. Look on how the Hebrew canon ends and how the Protestant canon ends. The Hebrew canon ends with Chronicles, which talks about the return of the people from exile. They were forced to live in Babylon, and after a period of time, God brought this Persian king in order to bring them back to their land. And that's how the Hebrew canon ends, in Chronicles. In Chronicles, the Hebrew canon ends with Chronicles saying, look how God is faithful in bringing us back to the land. Looking backward at their story. In the Protestant canon, it ends with Malachi. Malachi is anticipating a prophet like Elijah that will come. Looking forward, looking ahead. So even the simple arrangement of books here have some sort of a theological component to it. In the Jewish canon, they are looking backward at God's faithfulness, who promised to bring them back to the land to which they were exiled. In the Protestant canon, which is, again, the order of the books is based on the Septuagint, it's looking forward to a prophet like Elijah who is going to come, that we read in the book of Malachi. So, as we look at these canons, here are a few observations that I want you to remember about the Hebrew canon. The first thing is that in the Jewish canon, we have 3 parts. The Torah, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the writings. Okay? 2, the book of Ruth does not come right after the book of Judges. The book of Ruth comes right after Proverbs as an example of the woman of valor, the woman of power. The book of Daniel is in the Ketuvim, in the writings, because it's not prophetic book. It's an apocalyptic book. It's a book that follows a particular genre called apocalyptic literature, like the book of Revelation. Okay? The other surprising piece about the Jewish canon is that they consider books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as prophets. Usually we grew up in the church calling them historical books, and that's fine. They do have in some ways some affinities to ancient historiography, writing history in the ancient world. So we're not completely wrong about that. But it's interesting that in the Hebrew canon, these are included among the prophets, the former prophets. So some kind of like historical arrangement of how the Hebrew canon was canonized. Scholars believe that the Torah was likely canonized sometime around the late 5th century BCE or early 4th century BCE. So after they came back from the exile, Ezra and the priests have played a significant role, and the Torah played a significant role in shaping the identity of the people after they came back. And some scholars believe that these first 5 books of the Bible took their final form at that time. That's disputed. Some scholars say there were still additions and it was still like changing, but at least we could say by the 5th, 4th century, we're starting to talk about the Torah, the first 5 books, as standard, canonical, authoritative texts in the life of the people of Judah. The prophets, scholars suggest that maybe they were canonized around the 3rd century BCE, and that's one of the reasons why Daniel is not among the prophets, because Daniel, according to some scholars, was written in the 2nd century BCE. So the prophets were already kind of like closed or canonized in some ways. The writings, some scholars suggest that they were canonized around the 1st century CE. The 1st century CE. Some scholars early on thought that there is some sort of a gathering or a conference that happened in a place called Jamnia in Israel, Palestine, around 90 CE, where scholars or rabbis canonized the Old Testament. That's disputed. They were not sitting to talk about the canonization of all of the Bible. They were actually talking about the book of Esther, because it does not mention God, and the book of Song of Songs, because of the sexual descriptions in it. And they came to the conclusion that these are part of the Bible. So it was not like, let's sit together and canonize all of the books of the Bible. We don't have such a conference. It was more fluid, based on the faith community and worship and the like. Some scholars say that the Hebrew Bible, that all of the books that you have in the Hebrew canon, reached this final canonization because of the rise of Christianity and the Christian literature. So in response, the Jewish community started to close the canon. In response to the rise of Christianity and the Christian literature. How did they canonize it? It was a very messy process. We don't have all of the ins and outs. What did they use? And for the most part, what we can deduce from ancient literature and writings and thinking and reflection is that they use key figures. Moses, is associated with the Torah. So the Torah takes a significant, a place in the Jewish canon. Prophetic voices and the ways the prophets spoke to God's people at times of disorientation and disasters and, renewal. Formative narrative, them being, promised the land to the ancestors, entering the land and then being exiled out of the land and then returning into the land. Different theological themes and authoritative figures that have played a role in the life of the people. And spiritual authority, where the Jewish community believed that God revealed God's self in these texts, that these texts are reliable witness to divine revelation. Other scholars also emphasize the use of the text in the process of its canonization. It being used in worship spaces like the synagogue. And that's why maybe we have, not everyone had a Bible like yours. These manuscripts were very rare, were likely to be housed in places of worship. Not everyone just had a scroll of Isaiah at home and they just open it in the morning, just meditate on the book. We need to kind of start to accept this as a strange thing, that the Bible was not envisioned to be a book. When it was starting to be processed and written, it was not always available to every single faith community as all of these manuscripts at once. No. So it's really different when you start to stop thinking about the Bible as just a book and think about it as manuscripts, as scrolls. That if you would spread one scroll, you might take this whole room. of one book. So it was used with this faith community in Palestine in the early centuries in a particular way. That's why the Hebrew canon is different than the canon in Alexandria. Because the faith tradition there, or the Jewish community, interacted with different pieces of literature, or even Qumran. So the use of worship likely to have played a significant role in why we end up with different Bibles in this way. For Christians, the Old Testament is accepted as canonical in its witness to Jesus because of the New Testament and the way the New Testament read the Old Testament in light of Jesus, and even vice versa, read the event and the revelation in Jesus, of Jesus, or of God through Jesus in light of the Old Testament as well. So when you think about canon, in the Islamic tradition and the Christian tradition, we think of a more canonical, non-canonical, bound kind of canon dichotomy. That's different than the Hebrew way of thinking, or the Jewish way of thinking. In Jewish conceptions of scripture is more akin to centered set theory than bounded set theory, and I'll explain that in a bit. Its concentric circles work well with the law, the Torah. And this is one of the really important things in interreligious dialogue with the Jewish community, especially with us Protestants. We just want to go to the prophets. But for the Jewish community, the Torah is so important. It's foundational. It's at the center. We dismiss it because we don't like Leviticus, because of all of these legal matters that we don't apply them now, and we don't know what to do with them. But for the Jewish tradition, the law is at the center. You see the word law here, the circle behind me? Sorry that my face is covering that. Then the prophets start widening the circle. The prophets are still important, but they are not the center. You have it's a kind of concentric that is growing from a center to wider circles. The writings then are the third in authority, generally playing a supportive role. They become in conversation with what's in the Torah and what's in the prophets. Then we don't only, in the Jewish tradition, we don't only have the Bible. We have a wider circle. So let's redraw the circle now, thinking about Rabbinic Judaism in mind. You have the Torah in the center, as we started last slide. Then you have the Nevi'im, the prophets. Then you have the Ketuvim, the writings, which gives you what is known in the Jewish tradition as the Tanakh. Tanakh is another way of saying the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh. T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, and K for Ketuvim. Tanakh. That's the word that some Jewish people use as a way of reference to the Hebrew Bible. But then there is the Mishnah, which was encoded around 200 CE and was seen as a hedge around the law, intended as a kind of buffer zone guarding against sin. So it's in some ways trying to help people to avoid sin, expanding on the law, helping people to understand how they live a righteous life. After the Mishnah, you have the Talmud. And the Talmud comes from, a period where the Jewish tradition, whether in Babylon or Palestine, is debating. The rabbis among themselves are debating, what does the law mean? What does the law require of us here? How do we test that in light of the prophets and the writings? How do we test that in light of the oral law, the traditions? That's why the Talmud, you would have, opinions, not a settled matter. Rabbi X says that, Rabbi Y says that, Rabbi Z says that, and then it just leaves you with it. As a way of, yes, it is authoritative interpretation, but they are interpretations. The point that we need to start thinking about, whatever the faith tradition is, faith communities usually create a canon within the canon. When you think about your own church and your own reading of the Bible, there are things that you put at the center and things you kind of like put outside of the center a little bit, not because they're not important, but in your spirituality and in your denomination and in your congregation, they do not play the central role or the central part. So now we have kind of like talked about, in some ways, about the complex process of the formation of the text, the different textual witnesses, the messy processes of canonization. So is the Bible human or divine and divine in its origin? So unlike the Quran, which claims to be the very dictated words of Allah, over a 23-year period, the Bible was written by many people over 1,000-year period. Some fundamentalist Christians wanted what the Muslims have, so they came up with verbal plenary inspiration, which means that inspired means that each single word in the original languages was dictated by God through the Holy Spirit. No human agency here. My view, and the view that I will be advocating for throughout this class, is that the Bible is divine word in human words. Divine word in human words. God saw fit to use the messy medium of history and flawed humans, scribes, copyists, who sometimes made mistakes. That's why we end up with different textual witnesses and differences in manuscripts. And again, I want to say that this does not mean that the text that we have is not reliable. But it's not as Muslims think of the Quran, as dictated word for word. And then when you have differences, then it messes up the whole house. God freely chose to work through the messy mediums of history and humans to reveal God's self. So what is strange or new about the Bible? People who have become quite friendly with the Bible sometimes need to discover its strangeness in order to hear it in fresh ways. We have become too familiar with it that sometimes this actually blocks us from seeing something new and fresh in it. Our goal, this class and the one to follow, not to make the Bible strange and leave it there. Our goal is to help you take it more seriously, let it speak in ways it has not before, so that you can hear God speaking through it more fully. That we approach the text in new way, open to what God could say to us as a faith community here and now. There is nothing wrong with the old story, so long as that story has not been so thoroughly tamed that we cannot hear it speak in fresh ways. Some scholars actually talk about, first naivete and second naivete. First naivete is when you just take the text as is and you grow up with it this way, and then something happens to you, like seminary, that sometimes raises questions and messes things up, that sometimes leaves you in like always skeptical, or even very defensive to the point that you don't want to see the text in a new way. What we hope to acquire is this second naivete, which happened after actually being disoriented, after being taken on a journey to see the text in a new way, but not just to live with that skepticism or cynicism, but to rediscover it in new and powerful ways. to hear it and to hear God in a new way. Sometimes it's precisely the strangely new that turns out to have been there in the Bible all along. We just couldn't see it because of our faith traditions, our culture, the way we got used to it. We don't read it closely, or whatever the reason. Here we teach the Bible in its cultural and historical context, not because history is more important than God's voice today, but because we hear God's voice more authentically today if the words of Scripture make sense in their cultural and historical context. This is also true of understanding people from different cultures today. That is, I want you to start thinking about the Bible or reading the Bible as an intercultural endeavor. Just to start to train yourself to listen, to appreciate the Bible in its own historical and cultural context. Not because we don't think that the Bible speaks for us today. It does. The question is how? How could we hear and listen to the Bible in a more nuanced way for today is actually sometimes by going back to its context, cultural or historical, so that we come with a fresh way of understanding it, so that we would preach and teach with authority in our new contexts, in the church and in the world, to discover what God is up to in the world. Amen? I'm going to stop here. There is only one slide which has the timeline, but I will introduce that next week, which is also posted on Moodle. Don't print it. I have a printed copy for you. I will give it to you next week. But as you head out